The heavy mahogany doors of the Russo Estate Library slammed shut, instantly cutting off the ambient roar of the Chicago storm raging outside. Domenico's eyes, usually a warm, grounding hazel whenever he looked at her, were frozen over like black ice. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. He simply slammed a crumpled manila envelope onto the desk. A series of black and white sonogram photos spilled across the polished wood, stark and undeniable. Camilla's heart plummeted. He leaned in, the faint, lingering scent of Cuban tobacco and cold iron clinging to his bespoke suit. His voice was a deadly, quiet rasp. "Tell me who the father is." To understand how Camila found herself staring down the barrel of Domenico Russo's wrath, one had to look back to the blood-stained winter of 2021. Domenico was not a man who played at being a gangster. He was the undisputed architect of the Chicago underworld, operating under the sterile, corporate guise of Russo Logistics. He was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely untouchable. But the streets always demanded their pound of flesh. 5 years ago, a brutal ambush on Lower Wacker Drive had left Domenico fighting for his life. The doctors at Northwestern Memorial had saved him, but the internal trauma from a hollow point bullet had carried a heavy, permanent cost. Dr. Harrison Hayes, the Russo family's discreet chief of medicine, had delivered the verdict in a hushed hospital room. Domenico would never father a child. The bloodline of the Russo empire would end with him. For Domenico, this diagnosis was a wound that never quite healed, a silent shame he buried under layers of violence and expansion. For the syndicate, it was a ticking time bomb regarding succession. But for Camila, a civilian art appraiser who had unwittingly caught the Don's eye during a laundering acquisition at a River North gallery, it was supposed to be a tragic but safe reality. Camila had loved Domenico. Against all logic, against the frantic warnings of her friends and her own moral compass, she had fallen for the man behind the monster. She saw the quiet moments of vulnerability, the way he would trace the brushstrokes of a Renaissance painting with reverence, the exhaustion that weighed on his shoulders when the city slept. She accepted his world because she believed she was his sanctuary. They shared a sprawling, reinforced penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a golden cage where the violence of his daily life was checked at the door. But biology, much like the Mafia, cares little for human plans. It started in late October. The lingering nausea that Camila had initially dismissed as food poisoning from a rich scallop risotto refused to fade. Then came the bone-deep fatigue, a tiredness so profound she could barely keep her eyes open during her gallery auctions. When her cycle was 3 weeks late, a cold, suffocating dread began to curl in her stomach. She bought the test in a chaotic, brightly lit pharmacy in the Loop, paying in cash, wearing a trench coat and oversized sunglasses, feeling more like a criminal than her mob boss lover. Back in the marble-clad bathroom of the penthouse, the 2 pink lines materialized with a speed that made her gasp. She dropped the plastic stick onto the heated tiles, her hands trembling violently. Pregnant? In a normal relationship, this would be a moment of joyous disbelief. In Camilla's world, it was an immediate death sentence. Domenico was medically sterile. He had shown her the medical charts himself, a rare moment of agonizing vulnerability. "I can give you the world, Camila," he had whispered one night, his face buried in her neck, "but I can never give you a family." If she walked out of this bathroom and told Domenico she was carrying a child, the conclusion he would draw was singular and absolute: infidelity. And in the Russo syndicate, betrayal was paid for in blood. Domenico would not ask questions. He would not wait for a paternity test. The sheer insult to his pride, the agonizing reminder of his physical inadequacy, would trigger a blind, lethal rage. For days, Camila walked through the penthouse like a ghost. She stared at Domenico across the expansive mahogany dining table, watching the way his jaw tightened as he read reports from his capos, the casual, deadly grace with which he handled a steak knife. He was a man who ordered executions before his morning espresso. How could she tell him that the impossible had happened? That some microscopic anomaly, some spontaneous healing over 5 years, had allowed a miracle to take root in her womb? She booked an appointment with a private, out-of-network obstetrician, Dr. Arthur Pendleton, in a quiet suburb of Evanston. She used a fake name, Claire Bennett, and paid out of pocket. As she lay on the examination table, staring at the grainy gray screen of the ultrasound, Dr. Pendleton smiled. "There's the heartbeat, Claire. Strong and steady. You're about 9 weeks along." The rapid thump-thump-thump filled the small, sterile room. Tears, hot and fast, slipped down Camilla's temples. It was Domenico's child. She had never touched another man. This tiny, flickering being on the screen was the heir to the Russo Empire, a child formed from a love that defied medical science. But as she wiped her face and buttoned her blouse, the brutal reality of her situation settled heavily on her shoulders. She had to run. She couldn't stay in Chicago. If she tried to explain, Domenico would kill her. If, by some miracle, she convinced him the child was his, the danger would only multiply. The Russo family was a viper's nest. The moment the syndicate knew Domenico had a legitimate heir, the child would become a target for every ambitious underboss and rival outfit in the Midwest. She decided to hide the truth. She would wait until the end of the year, siphon enough cash from her gallery accounts, and disappear to Europe. She began wearing looser cashmere sweaters, claiming the lake effect winter was making her sensitive to the cold. She forced herself to eat small, bland meals in secret, masking her morning sickness by running the shower on full blast. She thought she was being clever. She thought she had time. But Camila had forgotten the cardinal rule of living with a mob boss. In the Russo household, there were eyes everywhere. Silas Castellano was a man constructed entirely of ambition and paranoia. As Domenico's underboss, Silas had spent the last decade positioning himself as the inevitable successor to the Russo throne. He was a sharp-featured, meticulous sociopath who favored tailored three-piece suits and a silver-plated pocket watch. Silas knew about Domenico's sterility. In fact, Silas counted on it. The absence of a blood heir was the cornerstone of Silas's entire strategy. He only had to wait for Domenico to step down or catch a bullet, and the empire would legally, organically, fall to him. Because of this, Silas watched Camila with the hypervigilance of a hawk observing a field mouse. He despised her. He saw her civilian morality as a weakness that infected Domenico, making the Don softer, more hesitant to spill blood. By the second week of November, Silas noticed the subtle shifts in Camilla's behavior. He noticed that she had stopped drinking the expensive Barolo wines Domenico poured at dinner, subtly switching her glass for water. He noticed the pale, clammy sheen on her skin during the morning briefings when he visited the penthouse. But most damning of all, Silas noticed her fear. Silas bypassed Domenico entirely and hired an independent private investigator, a disgraced ex-detective named Thomas Reed. Reed was tasked with shadowing Camilla's every move outside the penthouse. It didn't take long. Within 2 weeks, Reed followed her to the unassuming clinic in Evanston. When Silas received the photographs of Camila entering the OB/GYN clinic, followed by a hacked copy of the ultrasound file under the alias Claire Bennett, he didn't feel anger. He felt a cold, euphoric triumph. Camila was pregnant. It was the perfect, irrefutable weapon. Silas knew Domenico was sterile. Therefore, in Silas's calculated mind, Camila was a whore who had finally slipped up. This revelation would not only remove Camila from the board, but it would shatter Domenico psychologically, leaving him unstable and vulnerable, the perfect condition for Silas to orchestrate a quiet coup. But Silas was a master of the long game. Simply exposing her wasn't enough. He needed a narrative that would yield the maximum political advantage. If Camila was sleeping with just anyone, Domenico would simply kill her and move on. But what if she was sleeping with a rival? What if this unborn child could be used to spark a war that Silas could then finish, emerging as the savior of the syndicate? Silas zeroed in on the Moretti family, the sprawling Italian-American outfit that controlled the south side of Chicago. Dante Moretti, the young, volatile head of the family, had recently made aggressive moves against Russo supply lines. Dante was known for his reckless charm and his public disdain for Domenico. Using his network of corrupt fixers, Silas began planting seeds. He forged a series of encrypted text messages, routing them through burner phones to make it appear as though Camila had been communicating with Dante Moretti's top lieutenant. He manipulated security footage from a charity gala the previous month, the Street Jude's Winter Ball at the Drake Hotel, where Dante and Camila had coincidentally been in the same hallway for less than 2 minutes. Silas had the footage spliced and re-angled to make the brief encounter look like a desperate, hushed lover's rendezvous. Meanwhile, oblivious to the noose tightening around her neck, Camila was breaking under the strain. She was 11 weeks along. Her body was changing, her exhaustion peaking. The tension in the penthouse was suffocating. Domenico, sensing her distance, grew increasingly possessive. He would pull her into his lap, his large hands resting perilously close to her stomach, his sharp eyes searching her pale face. "You're a million miles away, Mia Cara," he murmured one evening, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across the library walls. "Just work, Dom," she lied, forcing a smile, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The gallery is acquiring a new post-impressionist collection. It's draining." Domenico's gaze lingered on her, heavy and unreadable. "You know you don't have to work. I can burn the gallery down tomorrow and buy you the Louvre, if it puts the color back in your cheeks." It was a terrifying declaration of love. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart, suppressing a sob. She had finalized her escape plan. Her flight to Zurich was booked for Friday under a forged passport. It was Tuesday. She just needed 3 more days. But Silas was ready to spring the trap. On Wednesday night, while Camila was organizing her emergency go-bag in the guest bedroom, the heavy oak door of the penthouse swung open. The atmosphere in the apartment changed instantly, the air growing thick and static. Camila stepped out into the hallway and froze. Domenico was standing in the foyer. He wasn't taking off his tailored overcoat. He wasn't loosening his tie. He was perfectly still, staring at the floor, flanked by Silas Castellano and 2 of Silas's most brutal enforcers. Silas looked at Camila, a thin, venomous smile playing on his lips. "Good evening, Camila." Domenico would like a word in the library. Camilla's blood ran cold. She looked at Domenico, desperately searching for the man who loved her. But the man looking back was not her lover. It was the capo of the Russo family, the executioner. Without a word, Domenico turned and walked toward the library. The library felt like a mausoleum. The soundproofed walls, lined with first editions and leather-bound classics, absorbed every breath, making the silence deafening. Domenico stood behind his massive oak desk, the storm lashing violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. Silas and the 2 enforcers stood by the door, blocking the only exit. Camila stood in the center of the Persian rug, her hands instinctively resting over her lower abdomen. Her mind raced, a frantic, desperate scramble for survival. Domenico picked up the manila envelope. The paper crinkled, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the quiet room. He turned it over and let the contents slide onto the wood. The sonograms, her fake ID, the forged clinic records. Camilla's breath hitched. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Domenico leaned forward, placing his knuckles on the desk. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying composure, but the veins in his neck were thick and pulsing. The scent of his Cuban cigar mixed with the coppery tang of adrenaline in the room. "Tell me who the father is," Domenico rasped, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of an anvil. Camila opened her mouth, but her throat was completely dry. "Dom, please, you don't understand." "I asked you a question," he interrupted, the calm in his voice more horrifying than a scream. He slowly picked up one of the sonogram photos, his thumb brushing over the black and white image of the tiny fetus. A profound, agonizing pain flashed across his hazel eyes, there and gone in a fraction of a second, quickly buried under absolute wrath. "I am a dead end, Camila. A barren man. The doctors made that very clear. So, unless we are witnessing the second immaculate conception right here in my study, someone else put this inside you." He looked up, his gaze locking onto hers with lethal intensity. "Who?" Camila looked past Domenico, catching Silas's eye. The underboss was watching her with an expression of hungry anticipation. Silas's hand was resting casually near the holster beneath his jacket. In that split second, the horrifying reality of the chessboard crystallized in Camilla's mind. If she told the truth, if she screamed, "It's yours, Domenico. The doctors were wrong. It's a miracle," what would happen? Domenico would demand proof. He would want a paternity test. But Silas Castellano was standing right there. Silas, who needed Domenico to remain heirless to claim the throne. If Silas realized the baby was legitimately Domenico's, he would never let Camila leave this room alive. He would draw his weapon right now, shoot her, and claim she had tried to attack Domenico. He would ensure the true heir died tonight. But what if she lied? Domenico pulled a secondary file from the envelope and tossed it onto the desk. A series of grainy photographs and printouts of text messages. "I already know, Camila. Silas brought it to me. Dante Moretti." Camila stared at the fake evidence. Dante Moretti. She had barely spoken 2 words to the man in her entire life. Silas had framed her. He had constructed the perfect lie. You went to the south side, Domenico's voice finally cracked, a tremor of pure betrayal bleeding through his iron facade. You let that arrogant, filthy bastard touch you. Under my roof, you made a fool of me. He drew his sidearm, a sleek, black Beretta, and placed it on the desk. Give me one reason why I shouldn't shoot you where you stand, and then go burn Dante Moretti's house to the ground with him inside it. She was trapped in an impossible paradox. If she confessed to the affair with Dante Moretti to save her child's true identity, Domenico would kill her for the betrayal. Or worse, he would slaughter the Moretti family, sparking a mafia war that would burn Chicago to the ground and result in countless deaths, all based on Silas's lie. If she denied the affair and insisted the baby was Domenico's, Silas would execute her right here, right now, to protect his succession. There was only one card left to play. She had to fracture the narrative, stall the execution, and create a wedge between Domenico and his underboss. She could not claim the child was Dante's, nor could she claim it was Domenico's. She had to attack the architect of the trap. Camila stood taller, dropping her hands from her stomach, forcing a terrifying calm into her posture. She looked directly at the black gun on the table, then up into Domenico's tortured eyes. I am not sleeping with Dante Moretti, Camila said, her voice steady and echoing in the quiet room. I have never slept with Dante Moretti. Silas scoffed from the door. We have the texts, you lying bitch. We have the footage from the Drake. Camila ignored Silas entirely. She kept her eyes locked on Domenico. Dom, you are the most intelligent man I have ever known. You built an empire by seeing the details everyone else misses. Look at the evidence on your desk. Really look at it. Domenico frowned, his hand hovering over the Beretta. What are you playing at, Camila? I'm playing for my life, she said sharply. If I wanted to cheat on you, do you really think I would choose your most public, volatile enemy? Do you think I would text his lieutenant on a cell phone that pings off Chicago towers? I know how your surveillance works. I know you own half the telecom grid in this city. Domenico's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't pick up the gun. He looked down at the printed text messages. Silas brought you this evidence, didn't he? Camila asked, taking a slow step forward. Watch your mouth, Silas snapped, stepping away from the door, his composure slipping a fraction. Boss, she's cornered. She's trying to manipulate you. Shut up, Silas, Domenico commanded softly, not looking away from Camila. Speak, Camila. Silas wants you to declare war on the Morettis, Camila said, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack. If you kill Dante, the commission will retaliate. You'll be dragged into a bloodbath. And who benefits if you are distracted, weakened, or killed in a street war? She finally shifted her gaze to the underboss, the man standing right behind you. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight. Domenico slowly turned his head to look at Silas over his shoulder. Silas's face was a mask of cold outrage, but a bead of sweat had formed at his temple. This is absurd, boss. She's a whore trying to save her own skin by throwing mud at your loyal men. Loyal? Camila laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Dom. Ask Silas how he found out I was pregnant. Ask him why he had a private investigator tailing me instead of bringing his suspicions directly to you. He didn't want to warn you. He wanted to build a case. He wanted to hand you a loaded gun and point it at the Morettis. Domenico looked back down at the sonogram, the tiny, fragile shape in the black void. He looked at the date, November 12th, 9 weeks. If it isn't Moretti's, Domenico said, his voice dropping an octave, raw and lethal, then whose is it? Camila took a deep breath. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. She looked at Silas, noting the way his hand was now gripping the lapel of his jacket, inches from his hidden firearm. She couldn't say it. If she said yours, Silas would draw. I won't tell you, Camila said softly. Domenico flinched as if he had been struck. What? I won't tell you who the father is, Camila repeated, her eyes filling with tears, but her voice remaining resolute. Because the moment I tell you, you will realize exactly how deep the betrayal in this room really goes. And I don't think you are ready to hear it, not with him in the room. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Silas Castellano. Send him out, Domenico. Send Silas and his dogs out of this room, and then I will tell you the truth. Domenico stared at her, the cogs in his brilliant, ruthless mind turning at lightning speed. He looked at the woman he loved, trembling but defiant, guarding a secret that warranted a death sentence. Then, he looked at his underboss, the man who had served him for 10 years, who was now standing uncomfortably rigid by the door. Domenico picked up the beretta from the desk. "Silas," Domenico said, his tone devoid of all emotion. "Wait in the hall." The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel in the cavernous library. Silas was gone, but the venom he had injected into the room lingered, thick and suffocating. The storm outside intensified, a jagged fork of lightning illuminating Domenico's face. He looked like a statue carved from granite, cold and unforgiving, his grip on the black beretta never wavering. "He's gone," Domenico said, his voice stripped of all warmth, reduced to a terrifying, raspy calm. "Now, you are going to tell me exactly whose bastard you are carrying, Camila. And if you lie to me, if you try to spin another web to save your own skin, I won't use the gun. I'll strangle you with my bare hands." Camila swallowed the bile, rising in her throat. The man standing before her was the apex predator of the Chicago underworld, a man who had built an empire on blood and absolute loyalty. To him, her silence over the past few months wasn't fear, it was a calculated treason. She took a slow, agonizing step forward, moving away from the safety of the leather armchair and into the center of the Persian rug. She didn't look at the weapon in his hand. She looked directly into his hazel eyes, searching for the man who had held her in the dark, the man who had confessed his deepest shame to her. "The baby is yours, Domenico," she whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile and desperately vulnerable. For a fraction of a second, the iron mask on Domenico's face slipped. A raw, devastating vulnerability flashed across his features, a desperate, starving hope that he violently crushed a moment later. His eyes darkened with a fury so profound it made the air crackle. "Do not mock me," Domenico snarled, his voice vibrating with a lethal, barely contained rage. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was bruising, his face inches from hers. "Do not use my greatest failure as a shield for your whoring." "Dr. Hayes showed me the scans, Camila. He showed me the tissue damage from the hollow point. I am sterile. Irreversibly. Permanently. You know this. Dr. Hayes lied to you," Camila cried out, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, hot and fast. She didn't try to pull away from his bruising grip. Instead, she reached up, her small hands gripping his lapels. "Dom, please, use that brilliant mind of yours. Think about it." Domenico froze, his breathing ragged, the scent of rain and Cuban tobacco washing over her. "Hayes has been with my family for 20 years. Why would he lie? Because he works for Silas," she fired back, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly locking together in her own mind with terrifying clarity. "Silas needed you to be the last Russo. He needed the bloodline to end with you, so the syndicate would legally pass to him as your underboss. What better way to ensure that than by bribing your chief of medicine?" Domenico's grip on her shoulders loosened a fraction, his eyes narrowing as the tactical gears in his head began to grind. It was a massive accusation, but in the paranoid, treacherous world of the Mafia, it was not impossible. "The bullet caused damage." "Yes," Camila continued, her words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "But remember the medication? The specialized nerve blockers Hayes prescribed for the chronic pain? You complained for years that they made you feel lethargic, that they clouded your mind." Domenico stared at her, the memory surfacing. Zoladex, a highly specialized synthetic hormone Hayes claimed was necessary to manage the severe neuropathic pain from the scar tissue near his spine. "You stopped taking them in late August, Dom," Camila urged, her voice trembling. "You flushed them down the toilet before our trip to the Amalfi Coast because you wanted to have a clear head for the sit-down with the Calabrian bosses. Do you remember?" Domenico swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence. He remembered. The withdrawal had been agonizing, a week of cold sweats and tremors in their villa in Ravello, but he had pushed through it. "I got pregnant in October," Camila said softly, her hands sliding from his lapels to rest flat against his chest, right over his hammering heart. "Exactly 6 weeks after you stopped taking Hayes's pills. He wasn't treating your nerve pain, Domenico. He was chemically castrating you. And the moment you stopped taking the poison, your body began to heal." Domenico stumbled back half a step, the beretta dropping to his side, his arms suddenly devoid of strength. The revelation struck him with the force of a freight train. He looked at the sonograms scattered across the mahogany desk, then back to Camila. If she was telling the truth, he wasn't a broken, barren man. He was a father. The tiny, flickering heartbeat captured on that ultrasound paper was his own flesh and blood, the heir he had spent 5 years grieving. But if she was telling the truth, it meant his most trusted lieutenant and his oldest friend in the medical field had orchestrated a half-decade-long conspiracy against him. It meant Silas had not only kept him childless, but was now trying to murder his pregnant lover by framing her with a rival boss, using the very baby he had tried to prevent as the catalyst for a mafia war. "Why didn't you tell me?" Domenico asked, his voice cracking, a haunting mixture of profound grief and burgeoning awe. "When you found out, why did you hide it, Camila?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me," she sobbed, wrapping her arms around her stomach defensively. "You believed Hayes. You believed the science. If I had walked out of that bathroom in October and told you I was pregnant, you would have assumed exactly what Silas wanted you to assume today, that I was a traitor. I was terrified, Dom. I was going to run away to Switzerland to protect your child from your wrath and from your enemies." Domenico closed his eyes, a shudder racking his broad frame. The absolute, staggering weight of his own monstrous reputation had nearly cost him his family. He had built a world so ruthless, so unforgiving, that the woman he loved couldn't even tell him she was carrying his child without fearing for her life. He opened his eyes. The cold, black ice was gone, replaced by a blazing, terrifying inferno. It was not the rage of a betrayed lover. It was the wrath of a father protecting his blood. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulling out an encrypted satellite phone. He dialed a single, memorized number. "Matteo." Domenico barked into the receiver, his eyes locked on Camila. Matteo was his ghost, a lethal, independent enforcer who answered only to Domenico, entirely separate from Silas's chain of command. "I need you at the penthouse. Bring a clean medical team, not Hayes. And Matteo, bring heavy artillery. We have a rat in the house." He snapped the phone shut and tossed it onto the desk. He looked at Camila, his expression softening just a fraction, a silent promise of absolute violence against anyone who had tried to harm her. "Come here," he commanded softly, opening his arm to her. Camila let out a choked gasp and practically threw herself against his chest. Domenico wrapped his strong arm tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against him, burying his face in her hair. He was shaking. The invincible Don of Chicago was trembling. But the tender moment was a luxury they could not afford. Outside the heavy oak doors, the serpent had realized his venom wasn't working. In the opulent, dimly lit hallway outside the library, Silas Castellano checked his silver pocket watch. 5 minutes. 5 minutes was an eternity in an execution. If Domenico believed the forged evidence, Camila should have had a bullet in her head 4 minutes ago. Silas's sharp features twisted into a mask of cold panic. The silence from the library was deafening. There had been no shouting, no pleading, and crucially, no gunshot. Domenico was hesitating, or worse, Camila was talking. Silas looked at the two enforcers standing beside him, brutal, thick-necked men loyal to Silas's payroll, not the Russo crest. "The boss has lost his nerve," Silas muttered, drawing his own weapon, a suppressed Glock 19. "The bitch has manipulated him. If she convinces him to look into the Drake Hotel footage, or if she brings up Hayes, we're all dead." The enforcers nodded grimly, drawing their own weapons. The coup could not wait for a discreet poisoning or a staged ambush on the street. It had to happen tonight. The narrative would have to shift. Dante Moretti's assassins breached the penthouse, killed Domenico and his whore, and Silas barely escaped with his life. Stepping up to take the throne, Silas raised his hand, signaling the enforcers. Inside the library, Domenico's sharp instincts flared. A lifetime of surviving the streets had tuned his senses to the microscopic shifts in the atmosphere, the faint scuff of a leather sole on the marble floor outside, the subtle, metallic click of a safety being disengaged through the heavy wood. "Get down!" Domenico roared, his voice booming over the sound of the thunder outside. He violently shoved Camila behind the massive, reinforced oak desk, just as the double doors of the library exploded inward. A hail of suppressed gunfire shredded the room. The expensive Tiffany lamps shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. Leather-bound first editions were ripped to shreds, pages fluttering through the air like snow. The expensive Barolo wine Domenico had been drinking earlier exploded, spraying dark red across the Persian rug like fresh blood. Domenico hit the floor hard, rolling smoothly to the edge of the desk. He brought the Beretta up in a fluid, practiced motion, returning fire before the enforcers had even cleared the threshold. The library turned into a war zone. Domenico's first shot caught the lead enforcer squarely in the throat. The massive man choked, his gun firing wildly into the plaster ceiling as he collapsed backward into the hallway. "Dom!" Camila screamed, covering her ears and curling into a tight ball beneath the desk, her heart hammering against her ribs, terrified for the tiny life inside her. "Stay down, Camila! Do not move!" Domenico bellowed over the deafening cracks of gunfire. He was entirely in his element now. The hesitation, the grief, the vulnerability, all of it vanished, replaced by the cold, mechanical precision of the man who had conquered Chicago. He leaned around the edge of the splintering desk, firing twice more. The second enforcer took a bullet to the knee, screaming as he went down, before Domenico ruthlessly finished him with a shot to the chest. But Silas was smart. He hadn't rushed into the fatal funnel of the doorway. He was using the thick doorframe as cover, blind firing into the room. A bullet grazed Domenico's left bicep, tearing through the expensive wool of his suit jacket and drawing a sharp hiss of pain from his lips. Blood began to soak his white dress shirt, hot and sticky. "You're a dead man, Domenico," Silas yelled from the hallway, his voice high and frantic. "The commission won't support a boss who chooses a whore over his own family. You're weak. And you're a dead man talking, Silas," Domenico shouted back, dropping the empty magazine from his Beretta and slamming a fresh one home with a sharp clack. "I know about Hayes! I know about the Zolodex!" There was a sudden, chilling pause in the gunfire from the hallway. The silence confirmed everything. Silas knew he was exposed. "You took 5 years of my life, Silas," Domenico said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, resonant baritone that carried easily into the hall. "You took my legacy. You tried to murder the mother of my child. There isn't a hole deep enough on this earth for you to hide in." Hearing the words, "mother of my child," spoken aloud by Domenico sent a powerful, involuntary shiver down Camilla's spine. Even huddled on the floor, surrounded by broken glass and the sharp smell of cordite, a wild spark of hope ignited in her chest. He believed her. He claimed the baby. Realizing his trap had completely imploded, Silas made a desperate, tactical decision. He couldn't kill Domenico in a fortified position, and Matteo's loyalists would be swarming the building within minutes. Footsteps echoed wildly against the marble floor of the foyer, rapidly fading toward the private elevator. Silas was running. Domenico surged to his feet, ignoring the bleeding wound on his arm. He stepped over the shattered remains of his office, his eyes dark and hollow, fixed on the doorway. He tracked the sound of the elevator chime pinging in the distance. He didn't chase him. A cornered rat in the penthouse corridors could still get lucky, and Domenico's absolute priority was the woman trembling beneath his desk. He quickly crossed the room, dropping to his knees beside Camila. She was pale, shaking violently, her hands still instinctively shielding her stomach. "Are you hit? Camila? Look at me. Are you bleeding?" Domenico demanded, his large hands frantically checking her arms, her legs, tilting her face up to meet his wild eyes. "No, I'm okay," she gasped, her eyes darting to the rapidly expanding red stain on his sleeve. "Dom, your arm. You're shot. It's a scratch." "It's nothing," he dismissed, pulling her tightly against his uninjured side. He kissed the top of her head, his breathing ragged, the adrenaline still coursing hot through his veins. "I've got you. You're safe. The baby is safe." He helped her to her feet just as the heavy thud of combat boots echoed from the private stairwell. Matteo had arrived. 6 men in tactical gear swarmed into the penthouse, their assault rifles raised, sweeping the destroyed library and the bodies of Silas's enforcers. Matteo, a tall, heavily scarred man with dead eyes, lowered his weapon when he saw Domenico, boss. "The perimeter is secure, but the private elevator went down to the garage. Castellano is on the run." Domenico nodded slowly, his face hardening into an expression that promised hell on earth. He looked around his ruined library, the symbols of his wealth and power shredded by betrayal. Then, he looked down at Camila, his expression softening, a possessive, fierce light burning in his hazel eyes. "Let him run," Domenico said quietly, the words dripping with lethal intent. "Lock down the city. Close the airports, the train stations, block the interstates. put a $2 million bounty on Silas Castellano's head, and bring Dr. Harrison Hayes to the warehouse in the meatpacking district. Tonight, we clean house. Dominico wrapped his jacket around Camilla's shoulders, the blood-stained fabric a grim reminder of the war that had just begun. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "No more running, Mia Cara," he whispered fiercely. "You are a Russo now, and whoever tries to take this family from me will drown in their own blood." The abandoned cold storage warehouse in the Fulton Market district smelled of old frost, rust, and the metallic tang of impending violence. It was a relic of Chicago's brutal, industrial past, a fitting stage for the reckoning of Domenico Russo. The storm that had battered the city had passed, leaving behind a bitter, freezing night that seeped through the thick concrete walls. Dr. Harrison Hayes sat strapped to a heavy steel chair in the center of the vast, empty room. He was still wearing his cashmere golf sweater and tailored slacks, having been dragged directly from his sprawling estate in Winnetka. The pristine fabric was now smeared with dirt and grease from the warehouse floor. His face, usually a mask of practiced bedside superiority, was pale and slick with terrified sweat. Domenico stood 20 feet away, shrouded in the shadows, smoking a fresh cigar. The only light came from a single, high-wattage industrial bulb suspended directly above the doctor. Matteo and 3 other heavily armed enforcers stood at the perimeter, silent and motionless as gargoyles. Domenico stepped into the light. He had changed his bloodied suit for a black turtleneck and a dark wool overcoat, his left arm moving stiffly beneath the fabric where the bullet had grazed him. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely hollowed out, which, to anyone who knew the capo, was infinitely more terrifying. He walked slowly toward Hayes, the rhythmic tap of his leather shoes echoing off the concrete. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, amber prescription bottle. He set it gently on the rusted metal table beside the doctor. Zoladex. Hayes stared at the bottle as if it were a live grenade. He swallowed audibly, his Adam's apple bobbing. "D. Domenico. Boss. Please. You have to understand. The nerve damage from the hollow point." "Save it, Harrison," Domenico interrupted, his voice a soft, rasping whisper that cut through the cavernous room. "I am not here for a medical consultation. I am here for a confession." "How long?" "Boss. It was a necessary protocol to manage the severe neuropathic flare-ups. If I hadn't suppressed your endocrine system, the pain would have crippled you," Hayes stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward Matteo, looking for any sign of mercy. There was none. Domenico sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound. He unbuttoned his overcoat and drew his beretta. Without a flinch, without a change in his expression, he leveled the weapon and fired a single suppressed shot into Hayes's right kneecap. The doctor's agonizing scream tore through the warehouse, echoing violently against the freezing walls. He thrashed against the heavy nylon zip ties, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as blood rapidly soaked through his expensive slacks. "I have a very low tolerance for lies tonight, Harrison," Domenico said, stepping closer. The barrel of the smoking gun now resting gently beneath the doctor's chin, forcing him to look up. "My underboss tried to murder my pregnant wife in my own home. You stole 5 years of my life. You told me my bloodline was dead. You watched me grieve. You watched me drink myself into oblivion on the anniversaries of my father's death because I thought the Russo name died with me. So, I will ask you one last time. How long?" Tears streamed down Hayes's face, mixing with the sweat. The aristocratic facade had completely shattered. 5 years. "Since the shooting," he sobbed, his entire body trembling from the shock and the pain. "It wasn't supposed to be forever, Domenico. I swear." "Why?" Domenico demanded, pressing the barrel a fraction harder against the soft tissue of the doctor's throat. "Silas!" Hayes choked out. "Silas came to me while you were in the coma. He knew about my debts, the offshore accounts, the gambling. I owed the triads over $4 million. They were going to kill my daughters. Domenico." Silas paid the debt. He cleared it all in one afternoon. But his price was that you could never produce an heir. Domenico stared down at the man who had delivered his younger sister, the man who had sat at the Russo family dining table for Thanksgiving dinners. The betrayal was so absolute it tasted like ash in his mouth. "He said you were too volatile," Hayes whimpered, trying to justify his treason to save his life. "He said if you had a child, you would soften." The syndicate would become vulnerable. He promised me a seat on the board of Russo Logistics once you eventually stepped down. I didn't want to hurt you, Dom. It was just a chemical block. Reversible. You played God with my family to cover your own pathetic weaknesses, Dominico said, his voice void of all empathy. He withdrew the gun, taking a step back. The disgust in his eyes was absolute. You betrayed your oath as a doctor, and you betrayed your oath to this family. Domenico, please. I have children, Hayes begged, thrashing weakly against his bonds. And because of you, I almost didn't, Domenico replied coldly. He turned his back on the doctor and walked toward the heavy steel doors of the warehouse. He looked at Matteo. Make it hurt. And then dump him in the Chicago River. Let the ice take him. As Domenico walked out into the freezing night air, the muffled sounds of Hayes's final screams were swallowed by the city. The doctor's ledger was closed, but the architect of the treason was still breathing. Silas Castellano was a man accustomed to luxury, to the finest silk ties and the warmth of a roaring hearth. He was not accustomed to shivering in a derelict safe house in Gary, Indiana, clutching a burner phone and waiting for a lifeline. It had been 4 days since the disastrous shootout at the penthouse. Domenico had locked down Chicago with a ruthless efficiency that Silas hadn't anticipated. Every capo, every lieutenant, every street soldier was hunting him. The $2 million bounty had turned Silas from a respected underboss into a walking goldmine. Desperation breeds strange alliances. With his own men either dead or abandoning him for the bounty, Silas had reached out to the only power in the Midwest strong enough to stand against Domenico Russo. Dante Moretti. Silas had promised Dante the structural blueprints of the Russo supply lines, half of Domenico's offshore accounts, and a guaranteed truce if Dante provided him safe passage to Montreal. The meeting was set for midnight at an abandoned rail yard on the border of Illinois and Indiana. The snow was falling heavily again as Silas stood between 2 rusted freight cars, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He checked his silver pocket watch. 12:05 a.m. He tightened his grip on his Glock, his nerves strung tight as piano wire. Headlights cut through the blinding snow. A trio of black armored SUVs rolled silently into the rail yard, their tires crunching heavily on the frozen gravel. They parked in a semicircle, boxing Silas in. Silas exhaled a shuddering breath of relief. Dante had come. The doors of the lead SUV opened, but it wasn't the young, brash Dante Moretti who stepped out into the snow. It was a man wrapped in a heavy black cashmere overcoat, moving with the terrifying, predatory grace of a king coming to claim his throne. Domenico Russo. Silas stumbled backward, his heart plummeting into his stomach. He raised his weapon, but before he could even aim, a dozen red laser sights painted his chest, head, and arms. Matteo's men stepped out of the shadows from atop the freight cars, their rifles trained squarely on the traitor. Domenico walked slowly toward Silas, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He stopped 10 feet away, his hazel eyes burning like dying stars in the freezing dark. Dante Moretti sends his regards, Domenico said, his voice carrying easily over the howling wind. It turns out, even the Southside Syndicate has boundaries. Dante despises me, Silas. But he despises a rat more. And he absolutely refuses to harbor a man who orders hits on pregnant women. He sold you out for a crate of Cuban cigars and a handshake. Silas let out a hollow, broken laugh, lowering his gun slightly. He knew it was over. The game had been played, and he had lost. You think you've won, Domenico? Silas spat, his voice laced with bitter venom. You think having a bastard child changes who you are? You're a monster. You're a killer. The moment that kid is born, you paint a target on its back. The commission won't tolerate a soft dawn. The commission will fall in line, or I will bury them next to you, Domenico replied evenly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He was the undisputed master of his realm. You made a fatal miscalculation, Silas. You thought love was a weakness. You thought Camila made me soft. Domenico drew his Beretta, the metal glinting in the harsh headlights of the SUVs. She didn't make me soft, Domenico said, raising the weapon. She gave me something worth burning the world down to protect. Silas closed his eyes, his grip on the silver pocket watch in his left hand tightening one last time. Domenico fired twice, 2 perfect, hollow thuds that echoed across the desolate rail yard. Silas Castellano collapsed backward into the snow, the bright red stain of his ambitions sinking rapidly into the pristine white frost. Domenico looked down at the body of his former friend, feeling no satisfaction, only the grim weight of absolute necessity. He turned up the collar of his coat against the wind and walked back to his vehicle. The house was clean. 7 months later, the heat of a late July afternoon radiated off the streets of Chicago, but inside the sprawling, heavily guarded private wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the air was cool and filled with a serene, quiet tension. Camilla lay back against the stark white pillows, her face pale, damp with sweat, but illuminated by an exhausted, euphoric smile. The sheer terror of the winter, the shootout, the betrayals, the flight from the penthouse felt like a lifetime ago. The golden cage had been dismantled, replaced by a true fortress built on trust, transparency, and a terrifyingly profound love. The door to the private suite clicked open, and Domenico walked in. The ruthless capo, the man who commanded an army of killers, moved with an uncharacteristic, almost breathless hesitation. He was dressed down in a simple black button-down and slacks, looking more like a nervous, expectant father than a mafia don. He approached the side of the bed, his hazel eyes wide and shining with an emotion he had never allowed the world to see. Camilla shifted her arms, pulling back the soft blue hospital blanket to reveal the tiny, tightly swaddled bundle resting against her chest. A shock of thick, dark hair, a tiny, perfect fist curled instinctively beneath a sleeping, peaceful face. "Dom," Camilla whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Meet your son." Domenico sank into the chair beside the bed as if his legs had completely lost their strength. He reached out with a trembling hand, his large, calloused fingers that had ended lives and built empires brushing feather light against the baby's impossibly soft cheek. The baby stirred, letting out a tiny, soft sigh, leaning into the warmth of his father's touch. A single tear slipped down Domenico's face, a silent testament to the miracle he had been denied. The miracle Camilla had fought so desperately to protect. The lineage was secure. The curse was broken. "Lorenzo," Domenico murmured, his voice cracking, speaking the name of his own late father, Lorenzo Arthur Russo. Camilla smiled, reaching out to weave her fingers through Domenico's. "Dr. Pendleton will be honored you used his name for the middle." Domenico leaned forward, pressing a lingering, reverent kiss to Camilla's forehead, then pressing his lips gently against his son's tiny head. The ghosts of the past, Silas, Hayes, the years of isolated grief finally vanished, banished by the quiet, steady rhythm of his son's heartbeat. "Thank you," Domenico whispered into the quiet room, making a silent vow to the woman and the child who had saved his soul. "I will give you the world, Lorenzo, and I will make sure no one ever takes it from you." The story of Camilla and Domenico Russo proves that even in a world governed by blood, silence, and absolute ruthlessness, the truth cannot remain buried forever. What began as a desperate secret born from medical deceit transformed into the crucible that purged the Russo empire of its most venomous traitors. Camilla's courage to navigate a deadly chessboard, refusing to be a victim of Silas's machinations, ultimately saved not just her own life, but the legacy of the man she loved. In the end, Domenico learned that true power isn't found in the terror he instills, but in the family he protects. The golden cage was broken, and in its place, a fortified dynasty arose, anchored by the birth of Lorenzo. It stands as a testament that even a monster can find redemption when given something precious enough to defend.